Good evening. I'm Malcolm Young, Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Winter Forum season. Many American policymakers are squeamish about religion's role in diplomacy. Nevertheless, religion plays a crucial and complex part in global affairs, such as in sustainable development, various human rights issues, and fomenting and mitigating conflict. Shaun A. the founding director of the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs, makes a compelling case for the necessity of understanding global religion in his book, Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom, The Future of Religion in American Democracy. In the book, Shaun recounts his team's challenges in D.C. politics, as well as in the major global events of his tenure, including climate change, the rise of the Islamic State group, and the refugee crisis. On a global stage with higher stakes than ever, effective diplomacy is imperative. Yet, even in this critical moment, the United States' reputation has faltered. Chasing the Devil at Foggy Bottom offers a path forward toward better foreign policy. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how understanding the role of religion in global politics is crucial for effective diplomacy. Shaun, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. It's great to be with you, and it's great to see you again after so many years.
Yeah, I really enjoyed getting caught up and kind of comparing notes about how things have been going for these last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, we were very fortunate.
Oh, yeah, we were so fortunate to have such great teachers and to have colleagues like each other, too. I felt very blessed for my fellow classmates. And you were always a senior classmate to me because I'm a little bit further behind you in my education. So, I've been thinking so much about the State Department's Office of Religion and Global Affairs, especially recently. I wonder what special insight it gives you into what's happening in Gaza these days.
Well, I have a very dear friend who actually is a Palestinian Israeli, was born in Nazareth. And he told me, in many ways, he's a mentor. He told me one time, he said, Shaun, there are no experts or teachers on the Middle East. We're all pupils. And over the years, when I think I've finally gotten up to speed or that I have something unique to say, suddenly I realize that there's so much more to be learned. But I think there are a couple of things, and we don't have time to really give a fully orbed analysis of what's going on there. But I would say a couple of things. I have a friend who's an Orthodox rabbi there in Israel, and he also proved to be a very good advisor when I was working with Secretary Kerry. Back in the Obama administration, we were trying to actually have a comprehensive peace agreement. And he said there will never be peace in Israel and Palestine until we sort what goes on. And he pointed up to the Temple Mount or the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock. And historically, Western diplomats have been very, very hesitant to address the religious dynamics of that particular piece of real estate. And the irony is, one of the conclusions I draw in my book is that we could come to a comprehensive settlement of all the other issues, refugees, borders, right of return, all those kinds of things. And if we kick religion to the end, then there are disruptors on both sides, both in Israel and in Palestine, who at the last minute could do overt acts of hostility up on the mount there that could completely undo any kind of comprehensive agreement. And so my fear is, we know now the Biden administration is trying very hard. Secretary Blinken, I think, is in Israel today and tomorrow, at least as we're speaking here, trying to push a two-state solution, trying to push a regional answer. But I think my rabbi friend's voice is still quite true, that unless we find a way to maximize access and safety, and access of people to their holy sites in Jerusalem and safety in going there, there's not going to be peace in that region. And that was the kind of thing we were trying to do, and that our government now, frankly, doesn't have a high capacity to carry out.
That was one of the things I thought was most prophetic about your book. I mean, you basically said something on the Temple Mount, that, like you said, that area of real estate is so crucial. And I do wonder how many global citizens are aware of that as being kind of an origination of this disastrous thing that's taken place in the Middle East. What do you think are the next steps? Like, I mean, obviously, there'll have to be a ceasefire, end of the fighting. How will that unfold, and how long will this take? What do you see as when you look at it as kind of a diplomat?
Well, I think the first thing is that there's very weak political leadership on all sides. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has a very fragile coalition and can only lose a handful of seats, and then he would lose control of the parliament or Knesset there. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority has an aging leader who's incredibly unpopular among his own people. And you really wonder, how can you come to a solid, enduring, sustainable agreement in peace with that kind of weak political leadership? And I think there's going to have to be, in a sense, an internationalization. The Gulf Coast countries are going to have to intervene and help supply money, rebuilding. The West is going to have to do the same thing. And that alone is just mind-boggling in terms of the reconstruction that's going to have to go on, and what's the political entity then if indeed a Palestinian state emerges out of that. So there are no easy answers there. And at the same time, on the religion question, that now there are a lot of religious leaders on the ground who've been working for peace on sort of a person-to-person basis, but that's very hard to do across the security line between Israel and Palestine. So it's going to take some outside diplomatic collaboration, but also convening. There are many opportunities for other groups to convene the various religious leaders and religious communities. And there is a fragile ecosystem of that going on now, but that's going to have to be deepened and expanded while the political work goes on simultaneously.
Yeah, I think you're doing the briefings for John Kerry when he was Secretary of State, and I wonder what kind of briefing is the current Secretary of State getting, and what are kind of his short-term, short-run goals? I mean, obviously the long-term goal is to have peace and have a settlement worked out, but what do we need to do in order to get there?
Well, I think the first thing is we've got to find a way to get the surviving hostages back to Israel, and then we've got to find a way, in a sense, to defang Hamas. And even after this brutal assault militarily of Gaza on the part of the Israeli Defense Force, Hamas has not been eliminated. So militarily, I don't think they can continue to do the kinds of indiscriminate bombing that has gone on because there's going to be nothing left of Gaza. And so I think the U.S. has got to use its moral voice to try and do two things at once, which is hard to do. One is to pressure Israel into realizing that the current form of warfare is not sustainable. And then secondly, to find a political alternative, help build a political alternative to Hamas, so that if indeed the shooting stops, Hamas doesn't simply use this as a time to regroup and take over again. So it's incredibly complicated. And the United States is only in a position to persuade. We're not in a position to compel. And I think that's what's frustrating for those of us who are sitting here in the United States today.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's so interesting that you focus so much on what's happening in the Middle East, but you also had a lot to say about just what's going on in Ukraine. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the role of religion in the wars in Ukraine, both the earlier war involving the Crimea and the current war that's taking place right now.
So in 2014, when Russia invaded and took Crimea and parts of the Donetsk and Donbass area, that's when our office was first getting ramped up. And so I'm building an office, but I've also, in my peripheral vision, I'm seeing what's unspooling. And I have to say, and I actually make this confession in the book, when I was studying theology at Harvard Divinity School, we didn't get a lot of Orthodox theology. Now, you did sort of before the Great Divide in 1051 or whenever 1054, I guess, when the sort of East-West split took place in Christianity. So I had to play catch up. Now, I'd studied ancient Christianity, Augustine and going back, but in terms of contemporary Orthodox theology, I'm embarrassed to admit I had read very little. So I had to get an education. I had to find tutors to help me understand the complexity between the various forms of orthodoxy in Ukraine. And there was the Russian Orthodox Church. Then there was the sort of indigenous Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And then a fairly interesting pluralism below that in terms of Christianity. You had evangelicals, you had some mainline Protestant types. And at the heart of Putin's sort of fever dream critique of contemporary Ukrainian politics, it is that the Russian Orthodox Church has been oppressed by the West. And if you read his speeches, there would always be this long section about how the Orthodox Church was part of what made Ruski Mir, or Greater Russia, in its day. And he felt like that it was decadent Western Christian groups, even some Orthodox groups, that were part of the Western attack on Ukraine or on Russia. And when I would read this and discuss this with some of the Ukrainian experts in the State Department, they were like, well, nobody would invade over finer points of theological disagreement. I mean, it's the 21st century. Nobody does that anymore. Well, actually, when the leader of Russia, the authoritarian leader, says that's one of the reasons he wants to invade and absorb Ukraine into the old Soviet Union, we ignore him at our peril. And one of the esoteric theological questions that was in play in that day was whether or not the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul would unite all the various Orthodox tribes in Ukraine under his banner, as opposed to Putin controlling the Orthodox equities in Ukraine. And I raised the question at senior levels. He's invaded once, but would he invade further now that the Greek Orthodox Patriarch has united all of the Orthodox parishes and, in a sense, stolen them from the Russian Orthodox Patriarch? And people were like, what is this union thing you're talking about? What is this dynamic? And I explained it to them. And in fact, I spoke with Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew twice, once in Crete and once in Istanbul, asking him, are you going to do this? And now he eventually did in the Trump administration. And lo and behold, Putin was outraged because he thought this Greek interloper was helping destroy the Russian Orthodox Church. And then the most recent invasion took place. And again, in his speeches, Putin referred to sort of restoring the greater Orthodox, Russian Orthodox world at the expense of the Greek Patriarch in Istanbul. Now, that's very arcane, even though I think most Americans their eyes glaze over when you start talking about Orthodox history and contemporary politics. But I think that was, in fact, a large part of the Putin propaganda trying to justify his invasion. Now, trying to sell that door to door in the State Department proved to be quite a marketing challenge for us. But we were able to communicate that we had to keep our eye on that ball and to understand there were religious dynamics in Putin's invasion, at least in terms of his rhetoric and his justification. Now, there's some people who say Putin's not an authentically Orthodox believer or practitioner, and I'm in no position to analyze the legitimacy of his piety, but it is, in fact, part of his great global propaganda machine.
Yeah, and even as I was reading those sections of the book, I completely recognized his public statements about LGBTQ plus people, the decadence of Western churches, because I'm very sensitive to those accusations. Because I see these as being human liberation movements.
Of course. And he has deep ties to some American Christian groups. He has deep ties to some conservative European groups who share the anti-LGBTQIA plus agenda. And that caught the eyes of a lot of diplomats in the State Department who tried to work very hard in promoting those and protecting those rights. So there is this weird synergy between certain groups on the American right and the global Russian Orthodox machine.
Yeah, and that's so important too. I mean, it's something I don't think normal people in the United States really get. You were so close to these actors, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see these conflicts in Ukraine. Like, how are they going to be resolved? What direction do you think we're moving right now?
Well, I think it looks very bleak. Right now, our own Congress can't seem to organize a two-car funeral, much less continue to support the defense of Ukraine militarily. And I think that the actual warfare is at a stalemate here, that the Ukrainian attempt to push them back last year was not successful. And, there are a lot of analysts who are saying ultimately this is going to turn into a sort of stalemated quagmire, and they're going to have to negotiate new borders and kind of cede Crimea and cede more territory in the east. to Russia. Now, again, I'm not an expert in military strategy, but it does not look. If we took the state of the war today, it does not look very good for Ukraine's goal to retake their former territory.
Yeah. As I was reading your book, I mean, I kept coming across different statements. I was wondering, just as you're starting to like meet the readers of your book and you're starting to hear people's responses, what are some of the more controversial things that you're saying in the book in terms of the feedback you're getting from your audience?
Well, I think a lot of Americans intuitively understand that religious groups are capable of doing things in public life that have political impact, either for the good or for not, for the worse. But they understand that religion is a complex thing. And now there were some people who said, "Oh my goodness, you guys in the State Department are going to be promoting a certain form of acceptable Christianity everywhere you went," and that always struck me as kind of funny because they didn't know who I'd studied with and not read any of my writings to this point. And I'm deeply committed to religious pluralism. I'm not trying to promote any particular Christian tribe in the global public space or global political space. But one of the things that John Kerry said to me, and I got to this job because of my friendship with John Kerry. Kerry had traveled the world for almost 40 years as a U.S. senator. And he had seen many places where he believed willful ignorance of religious dynamics had cost American diplomacy large sums. In the Iraq War is a classic case. Yeah. So I have a whole chapter on that where I show there were 4 or 5 stopping points along the timeline there where our willful ignorance of the religious dynamics of Iraq led to a quagmire, led to thousands of Americans being wounded or dying, and literally 1,300,000 Iraqis fleeing their country. And if we had
hundreds of thousands of deaths, I mean,
of course,
yeah. I just turned back to that to revisit that chapter this afternoon as I was, and it's absolutely horrifying.
And 7 to 8 trillion American dollars to pay for that war. And so my argument was, and Kerry basically says, "Shaun, this is my intuition. I want you to build an institution around my intuition." And I got a sort of a credit card with a lot of political capital to go around and assess religious dynamics so that our diplomats on the ground had as deep an understanding of civil society and political society in these countries as possible. And in some places, religion didn't play a particularly big role. But if you move to Ukraine and you look around for about 10 minutes, and if you say, well, religion's not a big thing here, you've clearly missed what's going on. And so our job was to leverage expertise on the religious dynamics and then educate our diplomats on the ground as to what difference these religious groups were making for good and for ill, or what could they possibly do in various directions. And in more often, so we basically decided to concentrate on the places where we could identify powerful religious actors and dynamics at work, and then help our diplomats use that information to point to better diplomatic outcomes.
Was there anything in the book that you felt like you needed to clear with the State Department, or you were just pretty clear what can be shared and what couldn't be?
Oh, no, I had to turn in the entire manuscript.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was wondering.
And which was, it's a very odd experience, because if you're a graduate student, you turn in your 40-page paper and you get evaluated by your professors. Yeah. There was nobody you could go to vet your papers before. And so here I'd written this book, and I'd worked on it for 4 or 5 years. And I was facing the possibility that the bureau that assessed it would come back and say, "Sorry, dude, you can't do," or they might have suggested edits. And really the standard was not whether they liked what I said, but whether or not I revealed any confidential or now ironically, we have a former president who wrestled with secure documents. But nothing I wrote about drew on classified documents. So I felt pretty good. But it was kind of nerve-wracking to turn in the manuscript, and they said, "Well, we'll get back," without a timeline. But no, I definitely wrote it with an eye to making it accessible and understandable.
Yeah, and I also,
And
I got to, there's so many places where you're like, well, I could go into this further, but I have to be confidential about this, and
yeah,
so the
yeah.
reader gets a sense for the magnitude of the work that you're doing, and understands that there's certain things that are just have to remain secret because of the nature of the work.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I do, and I was a little irritated when I did a lot of speaking in between early 2017 and in 2023 when the book came out. People would say, "Well, can you tell us, what was the most dramatic sort of TV movie worthy thing you did?" And I was like, yeah, they've been watching too many TV shows about diplomacy. That diplomacy is like Max Weber's old line about politics, that it's the slow and steady boring of very hard boards. And that our work was more of that step. Now, there was one time, and I mentioned this in the book, where a segment of our staff did, in fact, help a group of members of a religious minority flee a very inhospitable country and land in what proved to be a much more hospitable country. But I can't talk about that. That was all
Right. And I
classified.
remember you mentioned like even hostage situations, you can't talk about those too. Yeah, so that was good. It was enough for us to get a sense that there's, for the scope of what you were doing. But you're right. I think it's so important to just be educating people about those big religious questions that help us to not make mistakes in terms of how we interact with other people. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how the State Department office came into being, because you mentioned just being friends with John Kerry, and it certainly wasn't just that. I mean,
Right.
your academic preparation, and then the work that you did after your doctoral program had been completed. I mean, all of that led to this. But I would love to hear you talk about it, and especially with the idea of just like, there are other people who are going to be listening to you who are entrepreneurs, and you're kind of a State Department entrepreneur. They may be entrepreneurs in business or in nonprofits or in other fields. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like what it takes to start something new and to find a place for it.
Well, I met John Kerry in early 2005 after he had lost the presidential race in late 2024. And I have a dear friend, Mike McCurry, who many of you are familiar with. He was one of Bill Clinton's press secretaries, and he was on the board of the seminary in Washington, D.C. that I taught at. So I got sort of a free political education from one of the masters because he was on the board of governors. And in the last 6 weeks of that campaign in 2024, in 2004, I'm sorry, my timeline's off here. Kerry brought Mike McCurry on to run communications on his airplane because the campaign had not been doing a good job of that. And as you know, they lost. And McCurry's back in his office at his communications firm. And on Friday, after the Tuesday election in November of 2004, Kerry calls McCurry. And he's trying to process what went wrong and what he could have done better. And one of the things he says to McCurry is, I don't think I handled that religion thing very well. And McCurry, who's a master diplomat and communicator, paused a moment and said, well, Senator, I would not disagree with that analysis. And then Kerry asked him, well, what should I have done differently? And McCurry says, before I answer that question, let me introduce you to this crazy assistant professor friend of mine who's writing a book on the role of religion in the 1960 presidential race between Nixon and Kennedy. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, I'm sitting across the table from John Kerry, and I'm a nobody. I haven't written anything, and suddenly there I am, and we sort of developed this odd couple relationship because we come from two completely different backgrounds and symbolic universes. But he has an innate curiosity, and he's been a lifelong learner. And so I helped him write some speeches. We talked about religious dynamics in various theaters around the world. So I had stayed in touch casually with him between 2005.
I'm going to interrupt you really quickly. What was your advice to him about the presidential campaign? Like,
Well, because he didn't respond. His people. There was a certain Catholic cardinal in a certain part of our country who said if he comes to my town, I'm going to ban him at the communion rail. Yeah. Just very, very ugly. And the Conference of Bishops sort of said, no, calm down. That's not right. That's not the way to handle that issue. And all of his senior advisors, as I understand it, said, don't talk about religion. Don't talk about religion. And I said, I knew that he actually had a story. And I learned this after I began to meet him. He had a theological journey. He had a spiritual journey, but he never talked about it. Yeah. So if you Google, you want to see the speech he gave, Google Pepperdine University John Kerry speech, and you should find the text there of the speech that he gave. And I worked with him on that speech and said, if you have a story, you should tell it. You should tell how your theology, in his case, Catholic social teaching, shaped his values, and then finally, what difference did it make in terms of actual policy? And he gave that speech, and he came back just ecstatic, saying, "Shaun, I thought you were crazy when you told me I can do this, but I got a standing ovation from an evangelical college undergraduate audience." So that's when he realized he could tell his spiritual journey, not in a pandering way, not in a way to sort of ingrate himself into into communities that otherwise would despise him. And he spent a lot of time talking to a lot of different religious communities and religious leaders. So when he landed at the State Department in January or February of 2013, one of the first things that happens to you when you become a cabinet secretary is an army of attorneys run at you and they say, "Malcolm, here are 10 things you can do tonight with just a stroke of a pen. Here are 10 things you will never be able to do. So just scratch them off your list. And then here are 1,000 things where you've got open doors." And one of the things that Obama did in 2009, 4 years before this, was sign an executive order expanding the old Bush faith-based offices. And in that executive order, he authorized the State Department to launch a religion advisory office. And for whatever reason, Secretary Clinton never got it off the ground. So when the attorney told this to Secretary Kerry, Kerry interrupted him and turned to his chief of staff, who I'd known since 2005 as well. And he said, "David, call Shaun and see if he can twist his arm to come in and launch this office." Yeah. And so I was invited in. It took them about 20 seconds worth of arm twisting to convince me. And so there I was with a free ticket to build an office that we eventually had 30, 35 staffers to start this kind of diplomatic engagement across the world. And it's every middle-aged 50-something-year-old's professor's dream to get a call from somebody who says, "Come and run this thing, come and build this thing." And so anyway, that's sort of how it transpired.
As someone who knew you when you were young, it makes complete sense to me. You were on this trajectory from my perspective the whole time. But I talk a little bit about what advice you have for other entrepreneurs from getting this thing started.
Well, I think, we were talking before we started here, the job market for PhDs in religion literally in 1998 was not good. It's horrible now, and it was on its way to horrible then. I had a job offer in Fort Worth, Texas, and I lived in West Texas, so I'm not anti-Fort Worth, mind you, but to be on the path we were on, you really had no control. If you were going into the academic market, if there were 3 jobs, you were lucky to get interviewed at one of them. So you by disposition, you had to know that you could end up anywhere, and you had to be okay with that. Now, I was incredibly lucky to end up in Washington, D.C., teaching at Wesley Theological Seminary. So you got to be flexible, I guess, is the first thing. I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, "Shaun, I want your job. I want to do what you did." And I thought, I'm not going to tell you how many years of graduate school I did. It was insane. So you've got to be well trained. You've got to have a skill set, and skill sets aren't always just instant and innate. They certainly weren't that true in my case. I worked hard, and I worked a long time, and I might have been unable to find a dream job, but I've been incredibly blessed, incredibly lucky. The other thing I will say is, I told the story about Mike McCurry introducing me to John Kerry. I've had people in my crazy career who could have helped me, but never did. They ignored me. On the other hand, I had people like Mike McCurry who are connectors, and he shared so many contacts with me. And I always said, if I ever grow up, I want to be like Mike McCurry, not these other people who ignored me. And so I try to be open. I try to counsel people, and I try to be clear about what you need and what you don't need. But in terms of diplomacy, I was looking for people who had skills I didn't have. I knew one tiny slice of global Christianity. I knew a tiny slice of American diplomatic history. I had to build an office of people who lived religion all over the world, and in many cases had lived in that part of the world. They'd studied it formally. They had linguistic skills I could only dream of. So I had to build a religiously diverse group of people, which is hard to do because the federal government will not allow you to hire people based on their religion. But I had, a lot of people came to me who looked like me, and I was like, thank you, but I've got this slice of the world covered. I need people who can understand religion in places far different than my limited expertise. But you have to be open to surprise. And we built a remarkable team of talented people, and I had many, many early partners who helped me find those folks. So we tried to build a culture. I talk a little bit in the book about the sort of virtues and characteristics we were looking for on our team. And for the most part, I think we were successful in attracting people who were willing to work in teams in our office, but then to be diplomats within the building itself, because oftentimes the toughest diplomacy in the U.S. apparatus is stateside in the building of the State Department, not out in the world.
Yeah, that was one of the things I thought was so interesting. It's just like just trying to work with kind of your own detractors in your own organization, and even just going into meetings and hearing something that your questioner is asking you, and just knowing that somebody in an office related to you is undercutting you in that moment by letting them know the things that they knew in order to ask you that question. That was really, it's just. People always ask me about politics in a cathedral, and I said, to accomplish great things. I mean, one person like you were writing great books by yourself, before. But I mean, what you can do when you're with other people is so much better, so much greater. You have a much bigger impact, but it always involves that politics. You can't get away from it. When human beings are working together, we do amazing things, but we also have that political aspect.
Well, it certainly helped me that I was working directly for the secretary. Our Office of Religion and Global Affairs was nested in the Secretary's Bureau, or S as they call it in shorthand. So very few people kind of got in my grill and said, I think what you're doing is crazy. Most people were curious, I think was the way to put it. And then we had some people who were just incredible supporters. And so the naysayers tended to be muted. And I think also we showed we're willing to play and collaborate. We weren't there to cause more work or cause trouble for anybody. And we had to be collaborators, or we would have been kicked to the curb by the bureaucracy almost from the get-go.
Yeah. I loved hearing about the work that you did in Ethiopia and in Nigeria. I thought it was fascinating, the parts about climate change, the work that you did on behalf of the environment. It was an extraordinary tenure. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what it felt like in the kind of like the last days of the last Obama administration, just as you were leading up to the election, and then just what you came to realize after the election of Donald Trump.
Well, I worked on the Obama campaign back in 2008. So a lot of my staff were coming up to me saying, how's it going? How's it looking? What's your feel? And I always tried to be positive. I mean, I really did think that Clinton was going to win. And so that shows you my analytical skills were not.
Yeah, you joked about that in the book.
But so, as a diplomat, you're apolitical. You can't talk politics. You can't really do partisan work. And so in a lot of countries I guess in the summer of 2016, diplomats would pull me aside and say, I'll never forget one guy said, Shaun, has America lost its mind? Yeah. And I deferred and I said, not yet. We'll see. But it was crushing. We had our weekly staff meetings were on Wednesday mornings. So the election was on a Tuesday. It was called like 3:00 in the morning. And I walked into our meeting room with, 25, 30 of us. And it was as crushing an hour as I have ever spent in my life. I mean, I had staffers in tears, and I knew we were dead. I knew our work didn't stand a chance, and I talk about that a bit in the book. And it was really, really soul crushing in the next 10 weeks or so before the inauguration, and the knives were clearly out. And then, there were people in the new administration who were talking about the flaws of our office, which were just based on abject lies. And I tell the story about how I actually got a chance to come back in and talk to some senior leaders who were in the Trump era who were debating the fate of our office. And I had a remarkable conversation with a young woman who was in the policy and planning office of the Pompeo, and this is after Tillerson had left. And she said, "Well, Shaun, here are the stories I'm hearing about your office and its flaws." And there were three in particular. And I'm not going to roll them out here, but you can read about it in the book. And I debunked all three and had paper to prove it. And she was stunned. And I said, "Well, I hope this tells you something about the quality of advice you're getting from people about what we did." And so there was a fair amount of animus from some conservative Christian circles as to what we were doing. And that was very dispiriting.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been thinking a lot about Diana Eck and her interest in just the world religions and how they find expression in the United States. You're so familiar with that work, but in a way you were carrying on, the fundamental principles and values of that, of multiculturalism were just a profound part of what you were doing. And you write often about just, the religious freedom advocates in government, and just that they're just different animating philosophies between those two different approaches to religion and public policy.
Oh, that's right. And, it was very clear. I mean, a number of conservative religious, I'm for religious freedom. I'm not against it.
Oh, exactly.
But the way the legislation is constructed that created that office, it still has a pro-conservative Christian tinge to it. And that's unfortunate. I think that's really lamentable, but that was just a political fact. And a lot of those people were pretty ornery with me early on because they felt like somehow my mission was to undermine theirs. And they really were two different missions. My job was to advise the secretary. It was to equip embassies to engage religious actors and assess religious dynamics. And then it was also the third mission was to be the point of contact for any religious person, community, or entity who wanted to partner with the State Department on policy issues. They would come to us and see if we could point them in the right direction for some positive partnership. So it was a remit that far exceeded the remit of the Religious Freedom Office. But we met with everybody. There was only one person I refused to meet with, and you have to read the book to find that out. And I never asked anybody, who did you vote for in the election? I never asked them their party affiliation because we worked for the American people. And if we had printed the full range of people who came to see me, I probably would have been hectored out of office from far right to far left, because my job was to see if we could collaborate with people to advance American foreign policy. And a lot of times I met with people and there just was no overlap, and that was fine. But I never refused to meet with people because of their political background or affiliation. And I think that's the way diplomacy ought to be carried out.
Yeah. So we're heading into another election cycle right now, election season. Whoever gets elected in November, if they were to ask you to reconstitute this office, would you say yes to doing it? And then if so, or not, either way, how would you do it differently? And what would you preserve in it?
Well, okay, let's just say hypothetically I say yes. And then so I'm skipping your first question. All right.
I like that. It makes me happy to think of you back at the State Department.
Well, yeah, sure. I learned a lot. One of the things they did in the interregnum between accepting the job and then having my security clearance 4 months later, I had a lot of time to think. And my daughter, who was in early college, said, "Dad, how come it's taking you so long to get cleared?" I said, "You've lived the most boring life of any adult I know. It should be cut and dried." I said, "Thank you. I love you too." So in that interregnum, a consultant came in and wanted to stitch together various offices around the State Department that allegedly dealt with religion. And so suddenly we had the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism under me, but that's now a full ambassadorial office. We had the special envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is at the moment defunct. And then we had the special representative to Muslim communities, which is also defunct now, all layered in under me. If I were to go back, or if I were to advise somebody as they set it up, I think those other special representatives and envoys should go somewhere else. I would hope that the special representative would be able to just have the heart that I had. We had 3 teams. We had a regional team. The State Department divides the world into 6 regions, and I had an advisor for each of the 6. That's where the heart of our best work was. I would preserve that, and I would beef up that staff. We had a team of people working on these cross-functional issues like climate and refugees and LGBT rights, things like that. I'd preserve that team. And then we had a public diplomacy team, which helped us tell the State Department's story, both domestically and internationally. So I'd keep the infrastructure. I would probably be less entrepreneurial now. I'd know the hot spots around the region, and I would go to those regions and the people who work there to say, how can we help you be successful? And I would say no to a lot of other opportunities where
there was a lot you had to discover your first time, which you would already know now. So it would be easier for you to rank the 100 places that you should be in in priority order. Whereas, 20 years ago, that makes sense. So when you one of the things I loved about is just you connected with so many people around the world from so many different circumstances. What advice do you have for people who want to connect with people from other cultures? Like, do you have any rules of thumb for that?
Well, we did sort of draw up a set of principles or guidelines. And first of all, don't be defensive. The first time I met with an imam on the West Bank, let me tell you, I got an earful of grievances about U.S. policy, and you have to play the piñata. You have to listen hard and not be defensive. And after he kind of read his speech, I said, Your Excellency, I agree with you on 90% of those grievances you have. And he stopped, and the note taker from the consul, I think his pencil lead broke when he heard me, because I agree. And I told him the story about my first sort of public action in D.C. Was protesting the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. I said it was the worst mistake since Vietnam that our country has made. So you have to listen. You have to listen respectfully. And some diplomats feel like they have to defend every foreign policy America has done since 1789. It's like, well, no, you're going to lose those fights. But what you have to do then, you also have to signal respect for what they do. So I would do my research on their communities and on the individual leaders, and I would congratulate them for the humanitarian work they had done or the civil society work they had done, and to show that I had done my homework about them. And then you could have a conversation where you could ask the good questions like, what is your community's view of the peace process today? What would you like to see Kerry doing at the table with Abbas and Netanyahu? And then I would get information I could bring back to the people working on those talks, saying, this is what I'm hearing on the ground among imams in the West Bank. It's not rocket science, but if you go in combative, now there were times when people, that's all they wanted to do was to poke and punch me. And sometimes you do have to stand up and say, well, actually, invading Ukraine from Russia is a bad idea. And we can't agree on that. But you have to have a stance of openness. You have to have respect, particularly religious communities, if you come in disrespecting them. And the thing that worried me most, frankly, is you Googled me, it said Christian theologian, right? I couldn't come in. And they have Google, just for anybody out there watching, they have Google outside the United States. So, you had to assume that they had done their homework. It really is about signaling respect and genuine respect, but you have to listen. And ultimately, you have to have well-crafted questions that can elicit good information so you can have a dialogue, a diplomatic dialogue. And, I grew up in an Irish American conservative Christian family. I mean, there was argument at the dinner table, right? It's not my first sort of genetic response to say, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more." So, but having survived doctoral studies, you learn how to learn in tandem with people and learn from people. So I think if you're an entrepreneur, if you're pushy, if you're impatient, if you're in love with yourself to the extent you're smarter than everybody else, you're not going to do well. You're not going to attract people. You're not going to build relationships with that character set. So that, I think that was the gratifying part, is that we really built an office that was based around finding joy in your work, working collaboratively, knowing how to cover for people when they had family trauma. We came up with a set of overlapping values there that I think served us well.
Yeah, I liked your list of values that your office was going to have. I thought they were very helpful. Joy, human dignity, not being led by fear, flexibility, and I can't remember the other one, but there's one or two other ones. But yeah, I think just that humane approach to things it's just so important. We have one of the traditions we have on the forum is most of our forums are in person these days. Some of our forums are online, but we do take questions from watchers and listeners. And so I'm just inviting anyone who's watching to ask us any questions. Why do you think so many Americans have lost faith in government bureaucracies, and how could we how could the government begin to regain their trust?
I spent a lot of time going around the country, going around the United States, talking about our work and talking about our collaboration with the wider State Department. And the State Department historically has not told its stories well, and it doesn't have as much money. I mean, when I was there, I think the defense budget was somewhere around $700 billion, and the total State Department budget was like $50 billion. So, and that just reflects the reality today of how much of our budget goes towards the military and how much does not go towards diplomacy. But I made a promise that we were going to be going around telling our stories. Now, the good news is there was a network of thousands of religion scholars in religious departments around the country, most of whom were interested to hear what we do. Now, there were skeptics, and that's fine. Criticism should be a permanent part of our democracy, where people have a right to stand up and say, I don't agree, or can you help me understand why you do this crazy stuff? But I think the State Department doesn't tell its story well domestically. I think the news, unless there's a Gaza-like thing going on, or now with the Ukrainian war, I think there is journalistic fatigue with that story. It's not as interesting anymore. So it's hard. We no longer have a culture that reads mainline journalistic sources, and even those are coming under assault, explicit assault by a certain political party. So the atmosphere has changed, and the history of the department has not equipped it to be cutting edge in terms of how it communicates. And I think the partisan politics have now colonized diplomacy in a way. When I was a kid, I still remember people saying, partisanship stopped at our border, stopped at the waters, and that nobody believes that's true anymore. So it's a tough environment. And I'm not sure, because the world is on fire, if you're a diplomat, you think, yeah, I would love to go and talk to those college students there, but I've got so many other things on my list that are burning. I'm going to forego that opportunity. And there's a loss, I think, as a result of that.
Yeah, I think about just these new technologies. I mean, even us interacting online right now, it's like the invention of the printing press. It's almost like we haven't learned to make humane use of them yet. We're right. Still in an early phase of understanding how to make use of this extraordinary new tools.
That's right.
So I'm getting questions from our
Sure.
viewers. One question is, could you say more about the Iraq War and the mistakes we made due to ignorance of religious differences? Another way of putting it would be, if you had been in charge of the office in 2001, if it had existed then, what advice would you have given the Bush administration as they prepared for war in Afghanistan and in Iraq?
Well, I do have a very long chapter in the book where I lay out the different places. The first one is that there was really no intelligent vetting of the religious dynamics on the country. There were certain people who said, "Boy, we moved Saddam Hussein off the scene, and we will be welcomed, with roses and rose petals in the street." And that lasted less than a week. Okay. So we didn't, and I've looked at the available research and some of the declassified work, and you look at all these analytical papers that were written by the bureaucracy, and there would be like a single sentence saying like, "Yeah, there's this Sunni Shia thing." Yeah. You cannot understand those complicated dynamics with a one sentence affirmation that it exists. And then when the insurgency broke out almost instantly, we had no understanding. And I tell the story about how the leading Shia cleric, Ali Sistani, was literally not allowed to talk to Paul Bremer, who ran the Provisional Coalition Authority. It's one journalist said, Bremer and his staff thought this was just another old man in a turban, and they didn't understand. He was the most powerful religious leader, and he was wanting to help. The counterinsurgency doctrine that General Petraeus and others wrote had this absolutely incorrect view of so-called radical Islam, and saw it as a united global political movement, and did not understand the internal dynamics of that, and treated them as if they were a united sort of univocal entity, which nothing could have been further from the truth. So it was just a willful ignorance at several places. When they wrote their constitution, we were writing the constitution for them, and we wanted there to be a separation of mosque and state. And there were some conservative Republican senators who were insisting on that, who simultaneously were saying that America's oppressing conservative Christians and they should be left alone. And so the ironies there are just sort of endless. So I think an office like this should be in a policy analysis capacity. And if they had done that work, I think that office could have said that here are a dozen reasons why we should not invade. Now, the office that printed that would have been shut down pretty quickly. So that's politically risky business. But there was evidence there to be assessed, and the Bush administration decided not to, and at times suppressed people on the inside and outside who were offering that kind of service. So Kerry used to say quite frequently, we ignore religious dynamics at our peril. And I think the Iraq War is the classic contemporary example of that.
Yeah, thank you. Another question we have from one of our viewers is, what would you suggest we do if we wanted to encourage our representatives to take religion and democracy more seriously?
Oh, that's a great question. I think you need to look at the composition of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, HFAC. And if your congressperson or senator is on one of those committees, if a senator gets 6 or 7 letters on the same subject, they pay attention, because the volume of rational letters on things that are not in the headlines tend to grab staff attention. So look at who represents you in Congress and point them towards whatever your particular issue is. And if you happen to have somebody who's on one of those 2 committees, they are in a position to advise and shape the State Department.
What do you see happening in a second Trump administration or a second Biden administration?
Okay, well, yeah. I can't speak freely now politically. I think the fate of our democracy is at stake in this election. And in former President Trump, we literally have a man who's talking about weaponizing the White House to rain revenge on people he doesn't like. I think he was guilty of supporting the insurrection. I think the 14th Amendment, the 3rd section, overrules him from running again. Now, that may or may not be the conclusion of the Supreme Court. We'll see. So I think that's mayhem. I think that will be a lost generation if our democracy is able to survive the 4 years. Now, and that's not to say that somehow Joe Biden, it's all going to be sweetness and light. The issues they're facing, and I think Israel, Gaza is at the center of that. And I think they're doing everything they know how to do to prevent a regional war. But it may be the case that the forces of opposition and chaos there are too high, that we may tip over into that regional war, and God help us if that happens. It's just almost inconceivable how badly that can go awry. I don't have the slightest idea what a Trump administration would do in terms of the facts as they are today, but I do believe that the Biden administration does have a clearer intent, what they're hoping to do to avoid chaos, avoid a global war, but to build a two-state solution. I'm under no illusions how difficult that's going to be. It's going to be very hard to govern this country, I think, in the next presidential term, no matter who wins or who loses.
Yeah, it was one of the things you pointed out in the book too, just that the international climate was just getting so heated, and there's such pervasive challenges that it, that was a unique time to be doing this work.
Yeah, that's right.
So we I think so much of what people understand about religion comes from the press or comes from that kind of reporting. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see the press handling questions having to do with religion, and what shortcomings do you see and what strengths do you see in the American press's understanding of religion.
Well, I think the ecosystem is shrinking. I think the number of religion journalists is eroding. I think there was kind of a golden moment there a decade or so ago where people were acknowledging in newsrooms that religion, in fact, was under scrutinized and not understood well. I think what we have today, we got some great reporters, some really exceptionally talented. I'm not going to start listing them because I know them all, and I'll get mail if I don't put the right people in. Yeah, but like with white Christian nationalism, for instance, which is a very big thing. I think journalists today are missing, and a lot of analysts are missing something very important. We have a lot of taxonomies where scholars tell us these are the traits, and 20% of the people who live in this county are here on this scale, and people are on different spots. But what people are missing is that I think there are two components of the rise of white, three components. If I can hold these three thoughts together, one is we have a presidential candidate who seeded the clouds, who is in fact in historically unprecedented ways, cottoning the favor of these people. And that's, even with Trump loses, that's not going to stop. Looking for overt political action at levels historically unprecedented in our country. I don't think reporters fully understand that network, that connectivity between the Trump teams and Christian communities on the ground. I also think, in terms of actually generating more white Christians, there are two locations. One is online, and nobody knows how many people are radicalized into this ideological space online or face to face. And attacking it online is virtually impossible because of the size of the internet and the fact it's so decentralized. And frankly, our government doesn't have the ability, nor should it, to be going in and shutting down people unless maybe they're making explicitly violent actions as part of it. But where I think the real heart of what's misunderstood is this battle is going on in congregations in the white evangelical world. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people in those communities, and I've been talking a lot to progressive groups who are trying to mitigate these voices. And the fight is literally in the lives of clergy people. I know dozens of clergy people who are caught in these churches where they're feeling tremendous pressure from white Christian nationalists in their church. And they may even be a minority in their church. But in terms of volume, they're very influential. Nobody is resourcing those clergy and pastors in those churches about how to stand up theologically, ecclesiastically, and politically to those voices. And I'm not aware of any large-scale effort that is competent trying to help. Something like 40% of American clergy have thought about quitting in the last year. I think that was a Pew poll I saw a few months ago. So clergy today, particularly in conservative and sometimes mainline pulpits, are feeling this pressure, and they're not getting help to deal with it, either spiritually or politically or pastorally. And I think by and large, not entirely, the media has missed this fact.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shaun. We had Pamela Cooper White on the forum. She was out here in San Francisco talking about her book about white Christian nationalism. It really, I think it raised a lot of our consciousness about just how pervasive these voices are. And you're so right. I have friends who are caught in these terrible conflicts. They're afraid of particular members of their congregations. And
exactly.
Yeah, you know, and what do you do? I mean, it's certainly, we didn't receive a lot of training in seminary about how to address these problems, because they're you know, they have a different shape in our time than they did, you know, when we were being trained.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Well, I'm hearing the church bells, the cathedral the bells are ringing. It means that our time's up. I can't believe it. It passed like a blink of an eye. I'm just so grateful, Shaun, for what you were doing. And we were pulling for you. All of us who knew you when you were a graduate student, and we knew what you were doing in the State Department. We were very proud of what you're doing, and very grateful for you helping to understand the world. I was saying earlier that you, among all of us, were the one who really helped people to understand this idea of pluralism, this value of all religions, that each religion has different things to share in that global conversation. So we're very grateful for what you're doing, and look forward to hearing what you do in the future too.
Well, thanks so much, Malcolm. It's been a great conversation, and I'm really appreciative that you had me on.
Yeah. So I have a few more announcements. Please join me on February 18th in person at 9:30 a.m. for an exclusive sneak peek preview of Sign My Name to Freedom. It's a feature documentary about iconic National Park Ranger Betty Reed Soskin, followed by a conversation with the director, Brian Gibble, and Betty's daughter, De'Ara Reed. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. That's 76278. And I encourage you to have a look at Shaun's book, which is the link is in the chat. And Shaun, I look forward to seeing you again. Maybe we'll see you at the American Academy of Religion in San Diego this year.
I'd love that. Thanks so much.
Good night, everyone.